So there's nothing harder than starting a piece and nothing scarier than the blank page. So one of my strategies is to block off the first several weeks and just generate as many ideas as possible without judging them and without censoring myself. And nothing is too stupid to put down on paper, and nothing is too silly to consider. And over the course of day after day, my goal is just to put as many ideas, as slapdash as that might sound, onto the paper. And then what you hope is over time, some of them start to recirculate and stick in your mind and begin to grow and develop on their own. And that's when you start to feel like you're honing in on what the material of your piece is going to be. So I start to feel an idea is good when it starts to reappear in multiple forms. And what to me is sort of the test of an idea of whether it's good or valuable in a piece is that it can take on a variety of roles. It can be in the foreground, it can go into the background, it can change character. And when those ideas which sort of are themselves and then they say stuck in themselves, those seem less useful for building a big piece than ideas that seem to be able to transform themselves and be flexible. And so that's what I'm kind of looking for as I'm working on my sketches. Which are the ideas that have the greatest ability to transform themselves but still be recognizable? So I work at the computer and I use the software program Finale, not only for copying my music, which a lot of people do in terms of presenting a published edition of their work, but as my sketch pad. And one of the great advantages of that for me is I was trained as a violinist, and so I'm only a barely adequate pianist. And when you enter the music into Finale, it will perform it for you. And you have to be able to hear beyond the computerese limitations of the sounds, but it gives you a beautiful blueprint of what the music is going to sound like. And I really enjoy being able to almost imagine myself as someone in the audience just taking in my piece and having the computer present to me what the music is going to sound like. And so the only way that this works for me is that I have to save every single little change that I make, because of course the danger with the computer is once it's erased you can't ever get it back. So even if I change one note or one detail, I save it as a new file, and so my typical working day will be a whole string of files, even if I'm just working on one passage in the piece. So I'm a big believer in sketching a lot, and even if it turns out my best idea was my first one, I'm going to try it out many other ways. And that can even be going to the opposite, trying something completely wacky, something I wouldn't think has any chance of working. And I'll rough those things out, because you get more and more convinced about your decisions the more you understand that there were all these alternatives, and the choice you're making is not just because it was the only thing you could think of, but because it was the optimal choice considering everything else. So I'm not shy about throwing out a lot of material, and I think it's better to overproduce and choose from an abundance of options rather than go on a narrow path and overcommit yourself to something without considering the alternatives. And I will have a special repository for ideas that might not fit in the current piece that I'm working on, but I think might be worth coming back to. And there's several pieces that I've written which I took something that I'd actually sketched a few years before and revived it and worked that into a piece. And then there's other stuff that was just one of the ways that a particular idea could have worked itself out. It was either too much like some of the others or it just didn't fit, and then that's okay, you jettison those. And that should never be considered as waste. It's a necessary part of the creative process. It's wonderful as a living composer to know that your audience is alive in the same world that you are in. And we're reading the same newspapers, and we're watching the same television, and we're walking down the same streets and eating the same food. And engaging them sometimes in very public ways about themes and concerns that are very much on everybody's minds, as well as in the personal ways which are more abstract and more intimate. That whole spectrum is part of, I think, the fun and challenge of being a composer. And so when I wrote my chamber opera about post-traumatic stress disorder, I could connect with the audience in a very material way about something that, people are thinking about very consciously. And then at other times, my music will be just music in and of itself in a very abstract way. And I really think it's important and wonderful to cover that whole range. So how do you know when a piece is finished? You contrast this with an improviser who's composing live in real time in front of an audience versus this type of composition, which is done at the desk. And to write 5 minutes of music could take a month, could take 3 months, could take a year. There's no clock on, you're not being measured. So how do you know when you're done? And what I would say is that it takes about the most amount of concentration of anything I do to write a piece, and it's almost like diving underwater. And then when you get to the point when the music is really done, it feels like you resurface. And the piece sort of leaves your body and leaves your mind. And when I feel the piece kind of rising out of me and it's no longer filling as much attention as it possibly can, then I kind of realize that I've reached the finish line. Maybe my particular hero would be Beethoven for a couple of reasons. One is he's a great master and teacher about making the most out of a little. And he'll put his material through the paces, turning it into all sorts of characters. It's almost like an actor having a great role where they get to take on all sorts of different sad scenes and happy scenes and dramatic scenes and violent ones and loving ones and so on and so forth. The second thing is he's a master of pacing and holding the audience's attention by constantly introducing novelty. And he does it almost at the speed of human short-term attention. So I've learned all the time by listening to Beethoven, how fast do you change your ideas? How fast do you stick with something? How much do you change? The third thing is he really puts to the lie any kind of one-to-one connection between the composer's biography and what their music is. You don't listen to Beethoven's music and think, oh, that's what it must be like to be deaf. It's not. It's about the last thing that you ever think of when you listen to his music. And in fact, if you didn't know Beethoven was deaf, you would never guess it from his music at all. And then finally, I always feel about Beethoven that he wasn't trying to be Beethoven, he was trying to be not Beethoven. Every work of his, he's trying to surprise himself and do something he'd never done before. And that's why his life is divided up into periods. And that's why each of his pieces makes its individual mark. It's got a 7-movement string quartet and a symphony with a choir at the end, because he was constantly stretching the definition of what Beethoven was. And when we look back, we kind of recognize how it all holds together. But as he was living it, he was constantly pushing himself to find new pathways.